It's a story we all know and have heard about: the construction of the first nuclear bomb in the USA, the Manhattan Project, the Trinity test, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What did they do after? Today, 10 countries around the world have successfully created nuclear weapons. Others were supportive of one another. Almost all worked in the darkness. And nearly everyone used spies, competition, and treachery. All of these countries have a story as intriguing as the Manhattan Project. But those tales are seldom told. We're going to see the entire story of how 10 countries competed to develop this technology, as well as the other countries that approached it. Let's begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. Germany. The beginning of the story is in 1938, when German scientists discover that it is possible to split atoms and release an enormous amount of energy in a chain reaction. Albert Einstein made a similar warning the next year, when he wrote to the US government about the potential for weaponizing such technology. World War II was already in progress, and the race was on. Chapter 2. The United States. The United States is the country that was the first to develop nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project was a joint US-UK-Canada research effort. They devoted almost 1% of America's GDP to the task. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. In July, however, whilst President Truman was at the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Churchill, he was privately told that the successful Trinity test had taken place in New Mexico. Now America had its most formidable weapon known to man. Stalin was informed that the US was going to use this weapon on Japan. But Truman was not aware that Stalin was already working on his own nuclear program, and he had spies within the Manhattan Project. Stalin was angry that the Americans had won the battle. The next month, the United States dropped Fat Man and Little Boy on the Japanese, forcing them to surrender, thus ending the war and beginning a new race around the globe. Chapter 3. The Soviet Union. The technology was the second to be acquired, with the Soviet Union catching on as early as 1941 when it observed that its scientists' counterparts in Germany, Britain, and America ceased publishing work on nuclear fission. They believed everyone was involved in the arms race. The program had developed faster than ever once the Americans showed them the devastation of their own nuclear attack on Japan. They had a lot of information, but they also feared that they would be given false information by double agents. For this reason, they were not able to believe in the stolen American designs. Yet they still did a lot of their own research, employing numerous German scientists they captured. In 1949, the Soviets were able to successfully test RDS-1 in Kazakhstan ahead of schedule of the US. The US no longer had a monopoly on this technology. This would lead to the arms race of the Cold War. Chapter 4. The United Kingdom. The third country was the United Kingdom. One might think that the US would have done its best, as a close ally of theirs. This was not so. A lot of the groundwork was laid in the UK prior to the US with a project called Tube Alloys beginning in 1940, aided by the escape of German, Austrian, and Polish scientists. However, limited resources during World War II caused Britain to cede all their work to the US, combining with the Manhattan Project. The Quebec Agreement pledged the sharing of the technology upon completion by the US and UK. However, in 1945, the United States was able to test and use its atomic bombs and ended the pact, not revealing the results to Britain. This encouraged the UK to continue with their own nuclear program. They had already prepared much and held most of the world's uranium. In 1952, the United Kingdom successfully carried out its first test, Operation Hurricane, on the Montebello Islands just above Australia. Chapter 5. The Thermonuclear Jump. However, the Soviets were developing nuclear weapons far more quickly than the Americans had predicted in 1949, so the US immediately started on a new type of weapon known as thermonuclear weapons. These type of atom bombs would not rely on breaking apart atoms as normal atom bombs do, but instead fusion, which is the process that occurs in stars. These are much more potent. In fact, scientists such as Oppenheimer, the Manhattan director, have been urging the United States to abandon the development of such weapons due to the extreme dangers that their development poses to mankind. Despite this, President Truman gave the go-ahead. The first test of a hydrogen bomb was conducted with success in 1952 in the United States, where it was called Ivy Mike, which was more than 450 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The Soviets finished in 1955. The UK completed theirs in 1957. As a result of this new threat, the US made a decision to withdraw from a nuclear deal with the UK in 1958. Chapter 6. France. France was the fourth country. In the pre-World War II years, they already had a few scientists working on the Manhattan Project and began their own nuclear program after the war, working with Israel, though primarily on energy rather than weapons. That all changed following the Suez Crisis and growing animosity between the US and Soviets. France desired a deterrent policy and to maintain its power status in Europe. Britain was not as opposed to France's use of nuclear weapons as the United States, which had a different policy on the subject. Thus, France created them almost entirely on their own. President Charles de Gaulle declared that France must have nuclear weapons if it was to be a truly sovereign and great power. He was also seeking strategic autonomy from NATO, and the US-France obtained uranium from its colonies in Niger, Gabon, and Madagascar. Despite being in ruins after World War II, French scientists worked tirelessly. They were able to conduct their first test in 1960 in the French colony of Algeria under the name Gébois Bleu. They designed their first hydrogen bomb in 1968. Chapter 7. China. China would be the fifth country. They wanted to have their own nuclear weapons which they could use as a deterrent to the United States. At first, they were helped by a great deal by the Soviet Union, which viewed China as a useful ally. However, as Khrushchev started to de-Stalinize, China's chairman Mao criticized Khrushchev's more moderate policy toward the West as soft. This led to a rift. Khrushchev withdrew all of his assistance and left China to do the rest by itself. They were facing the problems of the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, and China went on with impressive speed. They were able to find huge amounts of natural uranium, which was a massive assist. In 1964, the first Chinese atomic bomb exploded in Lop-Ner. Just 32 months later, they tested their first hydrogen bomb, the quickest pace any nation has managed to go from fission to fusion bombs. Chapter 8. Israel. The next country is Israel, the only country in the world that has never claimed to own nuclear weapons. It's unclear when or how many were made, but there's been a lot of background leaked. Israelis had been cooperating with the French since the 1950s in the field of nuclear energy. Israel has a secret nuclear plant in the Negev Desert, assisted by France. This became a problem in 1963 when President Kennedy became concerned the Israelis were developing nuclear weapons. JFK wanted the US to be permitted to check the facility. Israel repeatedly denied and delayed, granting careful staged inspections and concealing underground facilities, which proved to be constructing weapons. The Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, was said to have been obsessed with acquiring nuclear arms. This split with the US has been resolved by the less aggressive stance of JFK's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, on preventing Israel's program. It is thought to have been completed circa 1967. It was only later in 1986, when an Israeli technician, Mordecai Vanunu, who served at that Negev installation, defected to the British press with the photos and documents, that the big break was made. He was then lured to Rome by a female agent who he thought he was going on a date with and was kidnapped by Mossad. He was drugged, returned to Israel, and sentenced to 18 years of imprisonment. Chapter 9. India. The seventh country is India. After World War II, they, like many others, called for this technology, primarily to deter and protect them from Pakistan and China. The studies started in the 1940s and continued for several decades. It accelerated after the failure of India in a war with China in the Himalayas in 1962. India was making nuclear power, procuring from nations such as Canada and the US, and also secretly using the power to make nuclear weapons. In 1974, the first test, Smiling Buddha, was conducted successfully in the desert of Rajasthan. The Indian government termed it peaceful nuclear explosion. This test provoked worldwide condemnation and sanctions because it was India's use of a Canadian reactor for energy and because India did not sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. India intentionally did not develop the technology into warheads immediately. The development of an active nuclear arsenal by Indian politicians was a slow process, as most of them were not in favor of it, and it would not be operational until the 1990s. Chapter 10. South Africa. South Africa, however, was one of the most peculiar and the eighth nation to develop nuclear weapons. South Africa had one of the world's largest supplies of natural uranium. By the 1960s and 70s, they redirected their focus towards weapons as Soviet influence extended into Namibia and Angola. Also, the apartheid regime drew worldwide condemnation, causing South Africa to become politically isolated without many allies for protection. They built a test site in the Kalahari Desert in 1977 and almost blew up a bomb. However, it was detected by a Soviet satellite and reported to the US, so the test was halted. US satellites spotted a double flash of light in 1979 near the South African-controlled Prince Edward Islands. It was known as the Vela Incident and is claimed to have been a South Africa-Israel nuclear trial. South Africa had developed 6 nuclear bombs by the mid-80s. With the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of apartheid in the 1990s, South Africa was concerned with the handover of its nuclear arms to the next government, so they opted to be the first nation in history to dismantle and dispose of their nukes. They then admitted to the world that they had actually possessed them. Chapter 11. Pakistan. Ninth country to join the process after the country lost a war with India in 1971, leading to the division of East Pakistan into Bangladesh. Their prime minister stated, "If India develops a bomb, then we will eat grass or leaves, even though we don't have any food, we will get one of our own." India had successfully tested Smiling Buddha in 1974, and the race was on. Abdul Qadir Khan is a Pakistani nuclear scientist who acquired the high-tech secrets for making uranium at a Dutch nuclear facility and smuggled them back to Pakistan. Pakistan was also greatly assisted by China, which donated the expertise, materials, and blueprints. China sought a second front to fight against India. Initially, the US did not try to halt Pakistan's program, partly due to a misassessment of its strength and partly due to a desire to have Pakistan as an ally against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. India conducted 5 tests, including a thermonuclear one, in 1998. Within a few weeks, Pakistan conducted 5 underground tests in the Rasko mountain range, successfully conducting their first test. India has a no first-use doctrine, while Pakistan has a first-use doctrine, maintaining the right to use nuclear weapons as per their will. Pakistan's threat of first use has made India wary of even contemplating conventional military action, an Indian military official said. Chapter 12. North Korea. It was the 10th and last country to become a member so far. Founder Kim Il-sung saw nuclear weapons as crucial to ensuring his regime's survival and deterring longtime rivals South Korea and the US. They had supported them in building nuclear research facilities for peaceful energy use in the 1950s. However, China and the Soviets had been successful in their refusal of North Korea's request for assistance in developing weapons. North Korea concentrated on developing its own program. Its huge uranium deposits are natural uranium. In the 1980s, the US learned that North Korea was attempting to make weapons from spent nuclear fuel. North Korea signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in the 1990s without the public knowledge of its weapons development. In 1994, they were offered LWRs by the USA that would be difficult to make into weapons. Initially, North Korea agreed, but the agreement fell apart in 2002. Primarily, the technology was also provided by Pakistan's AQ Khan. In 2005, Kim Jong-il claimed to have functional nuclear weapons. They were able to make the first successful test in October 2006. In 2009, they blew up another, much larger bomb, and again another bomb, this time in 2013. In 2016 and 2017, they tested their first thermonuclear bombs. Chapter 13. Countries that tried. These are the 10 countries that have developed their own nuclear weapons, but there are several other countries that were trying to develop a nuclear weapon but remained unsuccessful due to either lack of resources or international pressure. Argentina, Brazil, Sweden, Romania, Algeria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Syria, Taiwan, and Japan. Many of these were quite near. All of Iraq, Syria, and Iran made significant strides, but Israeli missiles and cyber attacks destroyed or sabotaged their facilities. It is widely suspected that Iran is the next country near the development of nuclear arms. Saudi Arabia's King Mohammed bin Salman has reiterated several times that if Iran has them, then so will they. Creating nuclear weapons is an extremely expensive and conspicuous process. A tiny explosion, concealed under a cloud in the middle of the Indian Ocean in the 1970s, was detected by a U.S. satellite. It is very difficult in today's world, given the sophistication of modern satellites, to have a secret nuclear program without the world knowing. 10 countries have finished the process. However, it's safe to say that there will be more additions to the list in the future. If you are still here, click like and subscribe. Then leave a comment. What was the most surprising aspect in the nuclear history of a country?